Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome back to the podcast American Medieval. I am your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I am just excited to be joined by someone I have known for a long time and someone whose work I've respected and someone whose work has taken a very different turn, and really spans both words of our podcast title, American Medieval, and that is Thomas Lecaque. Thomas is an associate professor of history and the director of the first-year experience at Grandview University in Des Moines, Iowa, land of corn. Welcome, Thomas. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm very excited to talk about your turn in your scholarship, which is very exciting. But before we do that, if you will indulge me, I have a question that I like to pose as a way of just kind of kicking off our conversation here. And it's maybe a little bit of a silly question, so I hope you'll bear with me here for a moment. So
yes.
And it's about time machines. So because, we're historians, we get asked about time machines. I think everybody who studies the past kind of gets asked about time machines at some point. But my question's a little bit different. So let's imagine for a moment that we have a time machine. Okay, and that time machine has now been presented to us or given to you, Thomas, and you have to go back into the past and tell a young version of yourself, a young Thomas, that someday you will grow up to be a medievalist, to study medieval history. How does young Thomas react to that news?
I think that really depends on what level of young Thomas we're talking about, because
fair enough. Yeah.
Up until high school, every version of me up until that point would be like, cool. Yes.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
And then high school me had just discovered theater and was very convinced that he was going to be an actor.
Okay.
That lasted through my first semester at Tulane University, where they gave us the talk that we can get your job backstage, but getting a job as an actor is luck. And I, like a good 19-year-old prima donna, took my toys and changed majors. But any period before that, I would have thought that was great.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be really easy to tell myself that and, tell myself to give my dad a hug and carry on.
Okay. This is very common. I should say, I asked this to all of our guests, and everybody has a different age that they're thinking of when I ask this question.
Yeah.
Right. But there's always something, it seems like, from childhood that they can kind of latch onto that makes sense in a certain way, and lots of twists and turns. Right. So maybe not the acting, though I think, a fair amount of teaching is indeed performance.
Yes.
That is absolutely 100% the case. So that's part of this as well. But what in younger childhood, Thomas, what is that connecting thread for you? Was it just kind of a general interest in the period? Some people say video games, tabletop games, high fantasy, or just they took a book out of the library and it just really kind of enchanted them. So I can't tell you how many times David Macaulay's kind of castles or cathedral has come up. So
yes, I had that. I absolutely had that.
Yeah.
You're going to have to forgive the self-indulgence here because we're recording this about 6 weeks after my father has died. But it's my dad. It was my dad.
Yeah.
My dad was trained professionally as a medieval art historian. His PhD is from the Sorbonne. He worked on medieval Bulgarian monastic art. And I spent my summers having the most incredible adventures. And my dad would take us on these road trips in Europe, and we'd go to castles and cathedrals and battle sites. And my dad could just rattle off what seemed like a truly incredible amount of information. And now that I'm in his age at that time, I get it. After a certain number of years of reading and writing, the places you're going.
Yeah.
It's they're the books. It's, I can say it's J.R.R. Tolkien. I can say it's all this stuff that seems easier, but it is traveling with my dad while he would take us to these actual medieval sites and bring them to life in these ways that I still can't do because I know a lot of stuff, right? We all know a lot of stuff. Our parents are still mythical in our heads, even when we know that they're humans. But my dad could just walk into a building and I would get the most incredible personal tours. Mm-hmm. I used to joke that the reason I picked my dissertation, there's the academic reasons I picked my dissertation, but most of it, I worked on medieval southern France in the 11th century. And it's I know you know this, but for audience purposes, hello. I wrote a dissertation. It was very long.
Sometimes I forget that, it's not just like me and the guest talking. There are
Yeah.
probably other people listening. At least I hope there are other listeners out there. So.
Yes. Maybe some of them don't already know me.
Impossible.
Oh God. My dad took me and my sister on this trip in southern France. And I was in that great junior high snotty phase where what I wanted to be was left alone to read my Star Wars book. This is like full-blown worst expanded universe. I think, in all fairness, I think I was working my way through Michael A. Stackpole's X-Wing series. So like, it was good Star Wars,
Okay,
right?
sure.
I wanted to be left alone. I deeply resent being pulled out of the car and pulled from this parking lot through this picturesque medieval town and to this picturesque medieval cathedral and to this picturesque medieval treasury until I bump into a plinth in a back room and realize that I'm standing in a pool of light in a room of darkness. And I look up and Saint Foy du Conque is standing there, all like 4 feet of golden, terrible child king statue is staring down at me. I jumped. I may have screamed. There is no proof of this one way or another. No one will ever know.
Yeah.
I had nightmares about her the rest of the summer. Right? I started paying better attention to where I was and what we were going to.
Yeah.
And that became like, when I was trying to pick a topic, that just became one of the memories about like, fundamentally the stuff I studied had much more to do with who I was later on. But like that memory of this trip I took as a kid with my dad was a core part of it, and also an ongoing joke because my parents came with me on my first big research trip.
Okay.
For my PhD, and we traveled to all of these sites, and the running joke, because it wasn't a joke, but they at least told the team, was like, but Thomas, you've already been here. Don't you remember? I was like, no, Dad, I didn't pay attention. We've had this conversation as we went place after place after place.
Yeah.
And my first like foray into this was my dad taking me through my research trip, beginnings, these places he already knew how to take me to, and like reintroduce me to it and teaching me how to like, how do you look at a church? How do you actually look at like the like illustrated capitals and the stained glass and the architectural structure and the doors, and like rediscovering my childhood and the things that made me want to be a medievalist with my dad again as an adult was a really cool part of it.
That's amazing.
So you get me at 10, yes, of course I'm going to be a medievalist.
Yeah.
You get me at 15, no, I'm not going to be what my parents are going to be. You get me at 25, it's like, yes, I'm going to make it. You get me at 30, I'm already there. I'm showing up to me a decade ago, having already done it. So
yeah. No, I mean, that's amazing. First of all, like for anybody who's not familiar, anybody who's listening, like please go Google the statue of Saint Foy du Conque, and you will understand that encountering that unexpected in a dark room would absolutely terrify you in a particular moment, because there is something kind of creepy about the way that it's kind of structured. It's amazing too, because the Miracula of Saint Foy, right, like has this kind of conversion experience of Bernard de Vagère, the initial author, like actually encountering it and having a very similar experience. Like there's something haunting about this statue. Maybe there is a supernatural presence there. Yeah. So yeah.
And then there's the horror movie quality to the actual Book of Miracles, where her big miracle is like, and then I killed the guy with my hands because he robbed the monastery. So I choked him out with a chain in the night. It's like, you have a 12-year-old ghost child who inhabits this golden statue who goes around murdering her enemies. I didn't know that at the time. She's creepy enough when you just see the statue. Yeah. But like the experience of going back to her as an academic, pretty much identical to the experience as a scared child.
Yeah. Really kind of humanizes the people in the past, doesn't it? It's just like, oh yeah, no, they believe that 100%. I get it. Yeah, 100%. Yes. So, but also like, I mean, that's really kind of a lovely story. Like, and I had a kind of similar experience, right? Like not as a medievalist, but my mom taught American history in high school and middle school. And so like I got dragged to every Civil War battlefield on the American Civil War battlefield on the East Coast. And like at certain points, like it was the coolest thing ever. And at other points, I just wanted to be home and hanging out with my friends and, doing other things. And so like, I couldn't tell you, like you were saying, like, you don't remember things. So it's like, yeah, like, my parents tell me like, oh yeah, no, we went there. It's like, Mom, I don't remember. Like I was 13. Like I was not paying attention. I was not thinking about anything that was happening except how much I didn't want to be there at the moment. But which I, of course, kind of deeply regret right now, but here we are. And I'm sure too, like having done very similar things with my child who is now, graduating from college and on to other things, he will have very similar experiences too. That's really amazing though too. And I think that's something that we as Americans oftentimes struggle with, or people living in the United States, I should say, oftentimes kind of struggle with, is kind of the reality or the kind of the materiality of medieval history when we talk
Yeah.
about it. Because we can go to a medieval battlefield, but like I remember too, my first trip to Europe, going to Canterbury very early on, like I did like a little summer thing in college, and like touching the stone, like the tactile experience of something like a hand hewn stone of a cathedral, it made it real in a way that I think it's hard for Americans to conceptualize. And I struggle with, and maybe you do as well, but like I struggle with that with my students sometimes, is to convey that these were people back then.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I didn't realize how spoiled I was as a kid until you're a grown up and you're actually paying for these experiences yourself.
Sure.
Right. But I grew up going to France every summer.
Yeah.
I mean, my dad was French. I'm French. I'm a dual citizen. I was born in Paris, spent the first 2 years of my life in Bulgaria. Like, I had a really weird and interesting childhood that I was too young to appreciate.
Sure.
But it didn't occur to me how far away this reality was for all of the people we interact with until you get here and you realize they haven't left the United States, most of them, because of course they haven't, because it's expensive and it's hard.
Yeah.
But the physicality of that was so important to my own journey and believing it that I ended up teaching medieval America
Yes.
as part of this. Like, that's like actually a big part of what I do in the classroom, because I love Europe. I'm European. It's important to me, but like, that's really far away and my students aren't going to get there. And I can show pictures, but it doesn't have a sense of scale. But you can get them to go to like a medieval mound city. You can actually show them places that they relate to here, where you have the actual medieval world all around them, and you can go visit and take them to museums and see the artifacts and get a sense of that if you're willing to bend outside of the canon we're trained for.
Yeah, and that's really amazing because, for so long, right, in such public discourse, we treat this continent as if it were uninhabited in this period, right? And there's all sorts of problematic things that we as scholars kind of have to deal with in order to think comparatively, right?
Yeah.
Because the year 1000 in Europe was different than the year 1000 in North America. It's different than, in Asia or Africa or something like that. But there were people here, and in fact, really complex, interesting civilizations in the Americas.
Yes.
At this particular period. Like you mentioned kind of like mounds and stuff like that. Like, can you just explain kind of what you mean here? Because I'm just a simple country historian in Appalachia. Like, I don't understand these things.
So I discovered the Mississippian civilization in Appalachia at Tennessee. But one of the things that's really fun is that French scholars get used to wherever you get your job. Like, you come out of your training, you've done a lot of work in the region, you went to school, you know these archives, but then you move and you have to learn the archives of the new place you've gone to so you can like teach students. I don't necessarily have that. I'm at a small teaching school, but it was important to me to try to connect our big surveys to a local enough thing that they'd recognize it, because our students aren't necessarily great with geography. Right. I don't think a lot of American students are great with geography, and Europe is really far away, and expecting them to parse the nuance of that, even though it's something that you and I know really well, doesn't necessarily track for everyone. But like, there's history here, right? If I'm talking about the year 1000, the year 1000 Europe is really cool for me and was really important for the stuff I study. But like, what does that mean to somebody who's coming from small town Iowa and has never visited Europe and doesn't really care? Okay, what's happening in the year 1000 in the Midwest? Right? How do we bring the Midwest into it? So in the 11th century, at a place on the east side of St. Louis called Cahokia, a medium-sized farming village has a sudden burst of transformation. They destroyed their entire old village. They relay it out on a celestial axis, probably on lunar navigation. It's just off of a true north-south center. They build a gigantic mound, Monk's Mound, which is still visible today and about 10 stories tall from the top. They connect that access down through a large plaza to a raised causeway through a swamp to a burial mound, all of this on this kind of perfect axis where they do ritual burials, and then they build a gigantic city around it. This is the site that we know as Cahokia. It's not named after them. They disappear in the 15th century. We don't know what they call themselves. But the movement they spawn, what we call the Mississippians, is a shared cultural aspect that comes out of this one city that goes through sports and construction and tools and religious paraphernalia, and is big enough that basically the entire American Southeast, the Midwest, and heading up into kind of the upper Midwest begins building cities in a similar style. Smaller,
Mm.
but the best version they can do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The sports that they play, which have religious significance, go everywhere. It's probably the only word we actually have from the original language. Everywhere you go, no matter what linguistic family does it, this game where you take a stone that's about the size of a hockey puck, you roll it really fast in front of you, and then you throw spears at it. So spear bocce, as I describe it to my
Okay.
students, is called something that sounds like chunky.
Okay.
And like, there's a lot that you can still see that's visible on the surface. There are large scale cities that still survive. The mounds are very big.
Yeah.
They're still there. You can go visit them, and they have a huge cultural imprint and legacy. And we never talk about them because we have taken the study of North America before the arrival of Europeans, and we've made it anthropology. And I love anthropology, but like, we've put it in a specific department.
Yeah.
And we never talk about it in a history classroom. But it's cool, and it's here, and they can drive to it, and the artifacts are cool, and they are here, and you can drive to them, and like, you can make it a day trip and go actually walk around a mound and see actual aspects of the Middle Ages here in Iowa, and it makes it real. It's not just like weird stuff we're talking about. This is a real thing that actually happened, and suddenly it's alive.
Yeah, that materiality, that tangibility, right? Like you said, like it is a 10-story mound just outside, like not very far from modern St. Louis, right?
Yeah.
Like it's there. 10 stories is big. It's real big.
Yeah, and you can stand on top, and it's very windy, and you can see everything, and all of a sudden you can see the city laid out around you, and like you feel it. You're suddenly part of the past again. The way you and I and you know, the way a lot of medievalists have had the experience. Like, I have now walked into the cathedral whose library I study professionally.
Yes.
Walked in the footsteps of these people that I write about. I want my students to have that, and that meant talking about the Americas as also a place where history happens and is real.
Yeah. And I think it's, you know, that transition, and I want to talk about kind of the specifics of that kind of transition and like, how do you transport those tools that we learn kind of as both as a graduate student, but as a medievalist, you know, more specifically, because, you know, one of the things like I think, you know, you're describing and that I've experienced as well is that oftentimes when you get an academic job, if you are, you know, so lucky as to get an academic job, because there's not a lot out there, is you're often the only person there who's working on anything even related to the distant past, right? Like maybe there's a classicist, maybe there's an ancient historian, maybe there's somebody who works on kind of pre-modern Latin America or something like that. But like where I was for, I would say 10 years, I was literally the only person who studied the Middle Ages across any department.
Yeah.
And so you do have to kind of adapt those things. But before we get there, I did want to talk about kind of the Mississippian culture too, because that's so fascinating. So that it's still there, and we don't talk about it as much in American history because there is kind of a medieval America, right?
Yeah.
In a certain sense, and those terms are problematic in their own way. But that it also flies against kind of one of the founding myths of this country, which was that this was an uninhabited place.
Yeah.
Right. So how do you kind of confront those things, you know, because you're trying to talk about, like, you do have to, you know, get to European colonization, of course. Right. But like, how do you in your classroom, in your teaching, like talk about medieval America as a vibrant kind of real thing and connect it to the story that these students oftentimes are just, I mean, it's just in the culture, like the things that we as Americans are kind of brought up with.
Yeah. So it's easiest in a medieval world class. So I'm lucky that we have a 3-course sequence for our world surveys. It's ancient, medieval, modern, which are problematic in their own ways, but you at least get 3 courses.
Sure.
I don't teach Europe in my medieval world survey.
Okay.
I've just left it out entirely. I've told them I love it. I'm happy to have you do it for your projects. I can give you far too many books that are everywhere, all behind me in my office. But we're going to actually talk about the rest of the world. So I do the medieval Midwest, medieval Africa, and medieval Polynesia. And part of the goal is that this is probably going to be the only history class they take, right? It works for a distribution requirement. If this is the only time we're going to do it, let's take your notions, because people have an idea of what the word medieval means, right?
Sure.
They might not know anything but like what we might call history, but I love this, Gen Z. There's a vibe. There's a medieval vibe.
There is absolutely a vibe, yeah.
There's a vibe. So cool. Take that vibe, and then let's talk about what's happening in the rest of the world. I also really like starting with the fact that, like, I'm going to use some words, and they're terrible words, and no one pays me enough to come up with new ones, but also you shouldn't let me. Right?
Yeah.
Does medieval work? No. Medieval is a specific idea that comes out of the Renaissance, that like everything between the fall of Rome, which never really fell, and the Renaissance is just like, we would like to not talk about this. It's just a middle age, and thank God we're back to civilization. Okay, that is only a European time frame. right? America's problematic. No offense to Amerigo Vespucci, but like throwing his name down on a pair of condoms also kind of sucks.
Yeah.
And also, every other set of terms we try to use are also problematic. Pre-Columbian is terrible because that's a teleological narrative
Yep.
heading to Columbus. Pre-colonial does the same thing. Indigenous, as applied to a time period, implies that this is not still an indigenous America where native peoples are still alive and vibrant and changing and growing and surviving all the time. So I take a day early on and be like, hey, let's talk about why words matter and why they suck. And then I feed them settler colonial theory and I make them read Patrick Wolf. I get one history class with these students. It's a 100 level history class. We're going to
Yeah.
start with talking why words matter. We're going to start with some theory. We're going to talk about why I've set up a class where we're not going to talk about Europe. And it's really that the world is bigger and more interesting and more beautiful than you know. And that's not your fault. And let's explore it. And then we explore it for a semester.
Yeah. I love this. I love it so much, because when I've done similar things, like the students aren't scared, right?
No.
Like they rise to the occasion. They're like, yeah, give it to me. Yeah, let's do this, right? And there's, sometimes they react and stuff like that. But like, yeah, let's talk about terminology. Let's talk about historiography. Let's talk about why we have the conceptions that we have. And they're like, yeah, like, let me learn.
Yeah. Most of them have never actually been taught a counter narrative or didn't pay attention to the counter narrative while it was being taught. So I don't think it has the impact it does with people of our generation who actually got, I think, more history education, but more history education that was trying to craft a narrative using history.
Sure. That's fair. Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that's happened with kind of the gentle, not so gentle cutting of history from the curriculum is that like all of the foundational narratives that we take for granted that they've been force-fed, those have also been partially cut because they're not giving you enough time to build bad narratives for us to dismantle.
Yeah.
So my students are just like, yeah, I don't know why I never heard about this. This is kind of cool. Keep going.
Yeah.
They don't get mad. They don't get pushback. They just never thought about it because no one tried to make them think about it.
Mm-hmm.
When I teach like colonial revolutionary America, I do start with the predecessor things, and then it gets a little bit more interesting, but that's just about crafting a narrative.
Sure.
And just putting Native history back into the curriculum as not just an add-on, but like an important component of the whole. And they're not really bothered by that. They also have the experience of like a handful of dates. And the moment you point out, it's like, what happens in the centuries between these like 6 events you've been taught before the Constitution? They're like, yeah, okay. And then they're okay. Like you just point out the gap and then they're like, okay, let's fill it.
Yeah.
And they're okay with that.
There's an innate curiosity. And I think that, there's lots of problems with the study of history at the collegiate level, as we know. Part of that is historians themselves, some of the approaches that they have taken towards the field, I think. But part of it is kind of cultural, is that students are being kind of consciously pushed away from these topics as being kind of unnecessary or not useful in kind of a really instrumental kind of careerist sense. But the students, when they're in there, like I found, they're hungry for this kind of information, right? And they can see connections that I don't think pundits in maybe prestige publications oftentimes don't give them credit for.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of it is always trying to figure out what the purpose of a survey class is.
Sure.
Right. And I think part of it is that all of my students are used to, I have to memorize stuff so I can regurgitate it on a test, and I don't have to know anything beyond that. And I do project-based classes. What I want is for us to get excited. To like take a semester and be excited about something.
Yeah.
Just join me in a journey. And if at the end of it, like we wave goodbye and move on, cool. You've gotten a taste of a bigger world. And I think that also makes it easier for them to just be excited about the parts of it that they get really excited for, and stress less about whether or not I'm going to be bad at history because history means X, Y, and Z thing. History is studying stories about the past through a wide array of lenses and then doing something with it. Like I want them to be excited about actually looking through those lenses and then doing something with it. And then if they join me in future classes, that's so cool. I'm so happy to have them. And if they move on to other classes, do it having some sense of the world that you're part of.
Sure.
Which is also why tying it to like where we are helps, because all of a sudden it makes it something more real than I think it would be otherwise. If I'm naming the towns you're coming from and talking about these things that when you go home for break, you can actually go see.
Yeah.
It's a different experience than just like, and these are the places you'll never go, and look at my pretty photos from this time I went on a trip you didn't go on before you were born.
Yeah.
I think we inadvertently make history more foreign than it has to be. And that's because we're trained to do that. And because the standards within the discipline insist that these are the topics that matter and these are the topics we should do. And there's nothing wrong with that. They do matter. They are things we should do. But sometimes you meet your audience where they are and you like, I just want people to get excited about the past.
Yeah. The best kind of history is both and, right?
Yes.
It's like, Europe and when we're talking about the Middle Ages, Europe is important, but like there's also other places, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's
Yes.
worth talking about those types of things. And not everything has to be everything. Like you said, like oftentimes in a collegiate setting, let alone in kind of a K-12 setting or something like that, like you have very limited time to do anything. So you just got to kind of pick and choose. And if you can get the students excited and they want to maybe ask more questions, maybe it gets them wanting to take another class, or maybe it gets them reading another book or looking up stuff, watching a movie, watching a documentary or something like that. Then sometimes that's enough, right?
Yes, absolutely. Part of it is that you figure out what parts are important overall thematically.
Sure.
I want my students to know about the kinds of elements we used to study the past. I want them to be able to talk about manuscripts and art history and architecture and music and the works. I don't have to do that through Europe, even though that's a really easy example. And so you take them through versions of that elsewhere. And then when they do projects, a lot of them then do things that are more European focused, but have talked about it elsewhere as well.
Yeah.
We have the themes that are important to us. It has to be, you have to actually look at primary sources. You have to deal with the paucity of primary sources in some areas. You have to learn that theory actually means something and not like fever imaginations on the TV, but like critical theory are a series of lenses for interpreting a limited handful of sources to actually uncover something meaningful with the sources you have. You can do all of this in a 100-level classroom if you commit yourself to it.
Yeah.
Not everyone wants to follow you down that path, but like you can get enough popular buy-in that you can give them most of the bones of what history actually does in a semester if you accept that that's what you're doing.
Yeah. And that's why expertise kind of matters, right? Like it is always better to have a conversation partner, kind of a guided leader, if you will, as they're kind of exploring these topics, because we know this stuff, right? Like we understand kind of like, how do you read sources? How do you understand the types of sources that are out there? How do you deal with differing accounts? Where do you go to find the stuff that you need to find? So, which is an awkward transition in some ways, because I want to get back to kind of your research here is just, well, not that we ever leave teaching, because research and teaching are intrinsically intertwined, at least in my head.
Yes.
So you started out as a medievalist working on southern France, wrote a really interesting project on Raymond of Toulouse, one of the great heroes, quote unquote, with quotes around it. You can't see the scare quotes that I'm doing of the so-called First Crusade. The topic was about that, but kind of more generally, we're interested in kind of ideas of holy war. Is that fair?
Yeah. Every project says more about the scholar than it does about the past.
Sure.
I grew up in small town Missouri. Most of my friends growing up were part of kind of Christian denominations that had an apocalyptic bent in the 90s and early 2000s, right? Crusade historians my age are all post 9/11, post invasion of Iraq crusade historians. There's a lot going on there. My interest has always been religious violence and apocalypticism because my friends were Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Evangelical Baptists. These groups that in the 90s are, eschatologically minded. And so I had friends, we'd have totally normal days driving around their cars, listening to like late 90s, early 2000s rap music. And then we have like sudden moments where all of a sudden people are talking about stuff that like really is martyrdom narratives. And most of my career is wanting to just understand these people that I loved with all my heart who inhabited a very different world than I did at the same time that we were together in this temporal one.
Sure.
And I think like the Crusades are an easy place to come to grips with some of that ideology without it being too close to who we are, right? Post invasion of Iraq, like you get this kind of narrative, like what we're doing is a crusade that becomes very political. And it suddenly becomes an interesting moment to ask, what the hell is a crusade? What do you mean holy war? What is this thing you've suddenly brought up in the 21st century and now everyone's mad about?
I remember, and I'm sure you're old enough to remember the absolute crisis that happened after George W. Bush just said the word, and was it like September 13th or 14th, like just a few days afterwards, like this crusade, this war on terror is going to take a while. Right. And all of a sudden, Crusade historians were writing pieces in every popular magazine imaginable, both saying that, Bush was right in using it, Bush was wrong in using it. So
Yeah. And I had no intention when I started in history of becoming a medievalist. I had no
Mhm.
intention of going crusades. I was very firm. I went from theater to anthropology to history, and I was going to be a Russian historian.
Okay.
It's going to be a Russian historian. Я не понимаю по-русски. If my mother listens to this, I do not speak Russian. I had my mother for a year of Russian. My mother was a brilliant teacher. I am so grateful that I know what a good teacher she was. I'm very bad at language acquisition. This is a lesson I learned under her tutelage. Not her fault, mine. But I wanted to say the Russian Civil War and the kind of like weird religious stuff that came out of the Russian Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
I had a fantastic professor, Sam Raymer at Tulane University, who's why I became a historian. And I took his 2 semester sequence of Russian history classes. I thought it was the coolest damn thing that ever happened to me. Like the medieval
Mhm.
stuff was great. We hit Russian Civil War and all the weirdness that I associate with like the 2000s was suddenly, oh, here, we're just a century before and we are in Russia doing this. Like, this is cool. I want to study this. And then there was a hurricane and I transferred schools and a lot of other stuff happens and I end up being a medievalist and it's all this stuff. And so it's been about like fundamental questions. For me, religious violence and apocalypticism, holy war, the narrative around that and all it means is just like that's my childhood,
Yeah.
right? And that's the people I grew up with and I love them but didn't understand them and want to understand them. And we lived in a world where we're using a lot of these terms in ways that seemed really weird, but I wanted to understand why and you do that. And I loved writing a dissertation on the 11th century. And I, at some point, need to finish the book project. And there are many people I owe this to. And if they're listening right now, hi, I'm sorry. It's been a rough couple of years. But like, that was a project that gave me a window into all the things I was excited about. I wanted to study what apocalypticism really meant, what like this idea of religious violence means for people who are otherwise just living normal lives. What is a crusade in all of the fundamental messy weirdness that we boil down to set events, and why would anyone do something that stupid?
Yeah.
And these are big questions and they're really exciting questions,
They
but
are. Yeah.
this is one moment in time. And the thing I got excited about coming back to materiality is that I had funding and support, and I would go to Europe. And I'm lucky that I grew up speaking French. So I would spend a week in Paris at my grandparents' apartment, and then I'd hop on a train and I'd go to regional archives and libraries. And I met the most wonderful human beings on earth who I miss dearly. And I'd stay at their houses and we'd talk about history, and I'd go to the churches around and the Archives départementales and be looking at the manuscripts. Like it's the immediacy
Mhm.
of the moment studying this theme that excites me.
Yeah.
And that's so good. And I love that so much. And then I got my PhD and I went on the job market and I got a job. And you know what that job did not have, Matt?
I'll give our readers 2 guesses. You'll only need one.
So the thing about going to Europe is it's expensive and I don't have a research fund. I teach
Yeah.
a 4-4 base load. I'm a department of 2. I am our pre-modernist, but I am also our early Americanist.
Mhm.
And so the research comes back to the teaching. So
Yeah.
I was going to be teaching colonial and revolutionary America, and I had never taught colonial and revolutionary America because I'm trained as a medievalist, and you only take classes in one time period. And so the first time I taught, I was like, I'm sure I can find something about religious violence that'll allow me to riff. And that's the direct, like 9 years later, that's why I'm working on a book project on holy war rhetoric in colonial America.
Now, hold on a minute. I have been reliably assured by colleagues, sometimes in history, oftentimes in political science, that religion is not a force in American history, though. So, and now you are sitting here across from me on the computer screen on our audio and telling me that it is. Now, sir, how can you make such claims?
So there's this beautiful place. We call it an archive.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
and then you go into it and you have all these preconceived notions of what you're actually looking at. And then you go into an archive and you're wrong. It's the best moment on earth. I mean, you know this. There is
Yeah.
nothing more fun than coming in like, this is what I'm going to find and discovering that you've been wrong about everything all along. When I started at Tennessee, Jay was working on his book on Apocalypse in the First Crusade.
Yes.
And
Jay Rubenstein, amazing colleague and historian. Yes. Okay.
oh, and just one of the best human beings I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. And like, I'm this baby grad student who, in all fairness, had never taken a medieval history class before. I had a weird route into my PhD program, and he's working on this book project because he set out to prove that the Crusades were not about apocalypticism. And then he started working on the Crusades, and he was just wrong. And so the book project is just basically a mea culpa and a brilliantly written mea culpa, and that was the next decade. I was just looking for some weird sermons. I was just looking for a couple of weird sermons for some flavor elements to put into a classroom because it felt like the source that was going to be most comfortable.
Uh-huh.
And in 1755, in the army camp north from Albany, speaking of places that we know,
Mm-hmm.
Theodore Freilinghuisen Jr., who's the pastor at the First Reformed Church, Dutch church in Albany, gives a sermon that gets published in New York City called Wars and Rumors of Wars from Matthew from the Little Apocalypse. And he lays out the endeavor of the campaign they're about to do up to Lake George against the French in an apocalyptic context. If he had preached that in the 11th century, somebody would have killed him as a heretic for going too far. Like Emico of Floheim would have his head would have exploded at the possibilities of a sermon this aggressive. And I read this and I thought, oh my God, what is this? Where am I? What are we doing here? There's an entire genre of sermon. The Congregational Library and Archives in Boston, shout out to the people there that I love dearly, has a box of sermons on the conquest of Quebec from 1761 for the Thanksgiving sermons.
Sure, yeah.
You would assume they were fabrications if we said they were from the Middle Ages. They're too far. They've gone too far every single step of the way. And it's all of them.
Yeah.
Every single one. These people who get really mild afterwards are writing these things of France as the mother of harlots. They refer to Quebec as the North American Babylon. They talk about like this war as the proof of like the failure of the pagan French. It becomes this narrative of religious violence in an apocalyptic context that like Raymond Daguerre, my favorite apocalyptic First Crusade scholar, would have been too scared to write something this wild. These things get published and distributed and they're everywhere. And so like I got to the actual point of reading the primary documents and people were like, we're in enlightenment. Like where? Where is the enlightenment in this? Show me. And so it's a teaching thing. I was looking for primary sources for teaching. And then I had the crisis for like, I could never work on the Americas. I'm trained as a medievalist. People never change field. And in all fairness, people never change from being a medievalist to an early modernist with, as far as I can tell, one real exception. The only professor that I've actually, no offense, Matt, because you know I love you, but like the only professor I've actually been speechless when I met, Amy Remensnyder.
Oh, no, 100% justified. Like, amazing.
I just, Remembering King's Past was the book that convinced me I should do Southern France. She came out with La Conquistadora, and I met her when she was like coming and like talking at universities about La Conquistadora, and I read the book, and like, I couldn't talk. I stumbled over my words trying to introduce myself. It is the most embarrassing moment I've ever had in a professional context. But like, yes, it's her book. She's the only other person I know who has made this jump, and like I'm hoping to be the second.
She came to I did my PhD at Berkeley, and she was a guest professor for a year because some of the faculty were on leave, and they brought her in as a guest professor. She ran a seminar. I took a course with her. I had read Remembering King's Past, so I was like kind of in awe, like just like you're talking about. Amazing book. And then I remember one time like I said something in class and I can't even remember what it is, but I distinctly remember her just kind of looking at me and smiling. And she's the kindest person you will ever meet. Like just a wonderful human being. It's like, Matt, why would you think that? And I just remember like wanting to crawl into the sea. Like I just wanted to head west into the bay and just like keep walking. But she was right. I was making claims about things that weren't in the sources. And that's what kind of the best teachers do. And like, this is kind of what you're talking about, is having that experience in the archive, right? And just being like, you know, and I'm just like, I'm almost dying here. Like, you can't see the video, right? But like, I'm just like thinking about like, this is medievalists encountering early American sermons and being like, what the fuck is going on?
Yes.
Medievalists are saying that, right? Like, you know, stuff is crazy when that happens.
Yes. And so like at that point, I knew I was hooked. My best friend and my frequent co-author and the person I'm co-writing this book with, so my David Perry is Jay Tomlin, who's at Fairmont State University, and he's an Americanist, and we've been friends since grad school, and we had been not joking about writing a book together. And I finally like called him, like, Jay, we have to do a book. We have to do the book.
Yeah.
We have to write the book. It's there. It's everywhere. I see it now. This thing you've been telling me, it's everywhere. And I just started applying for grants. Right? Because the thing that makes being a historian so magical is you get into an actual archive, and then you get into the archive and everything changes. And I got very lucky that I presented at a conference. I met a guy who was on the board of the Congregational Library who was like, you should just apply for this grant. I thought, okay, I guess I will. And got it, had a transformative experience at the Congregational Library in the Boston Athenaeum. applied for a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grant to go to 6 libraries last year and did that, and it was incredible. I have a short-term fellowship at the Massachusetts Historical Society for the spring, and then I'm going to apply for a handful more. And every time I go into the archives, I discover that this thing that I thought was not real, and I might find 1 or 2 examples, is everywhere. It's all the sermons. It's all the sermons for the like 80-year period we're writing on, but also beyond into the Revolution and the War of 1812, and that's the next book project in some indeterminate future. But it's not just sermons, it's in the letters, it's in the journals, it's in music. There's a lot of diaries get written into almanacs, and I usually don't pay attention to the text of an almanac. It's an almanac. I'm looking for the journal. And I'm reading this almanac in historic Deerfield's reading room, and the guy just is writing this line everywhere over the front of this almanac. Is like, that's weird. That's completely disassociated from everything else. It's 1758. You're writing weird stuff. Maybe it's the war. It's the title of the poem on the back, which ends with basically a call to genocide against Catholics in all of the Americas.
Wow.
The back of the almanac has a holy war poem on it. It's the almanac. It's the farmer's almanac. Is telling you to butcher the Catholics for God.
This is when you should plant your legumes, and this is when you should butcher Catholics because they're agents of the Antichrist and the Holy War is here. Yeah.
Yes.
1758 in Massachusetts.
And once you're there, you can't not see it.
Yeah.
And it's the archives. And it's like all the narratives. Yes, there's Enlightenment elements in America, but like you're coming out of a period of a level of religious violence and apocalyptic rhetoric that I don't know where the comparable period in the Middle Ages would be. It's as if the quote unquote peasants crusade never stopped, but it was the whole movement.
Yeah.
And it was every town and every church all the time forever. But it's published. Like people are printing these.
Yeah.
This is not just like your handwritten scrawling weird somewhere. You're publishing them.
And these are not fringe guys, right? Like that we're talking about. Like, I mean, these are pastors in respected members of communities in English settled kind of North America.
There are not a lot of printing presses in the British colonies, certainly more than in France, but there are not a ton of printing presses. So if you have enough printed copies that I'm holding one in my hands, that's a specific thing all in itself.
Sure.
And there are like moments where you get like specific organizations who print them, but like we know Cotton Mather, and we have ideas about Cotton Mather, and usually around witchcraft, which takes place during King William's War and has a whole valence structure around it that ties into all of this. But like he's preaching this in 1690 in the time we're not talking, because we don't talk about the war itself, just the witch trial. He's preaching holy war against Quebec in the lead up to a failed expedition against Quebec. His dad does bits and pieces of it, even while disagreeing with his son about everything else. It is every major player is writing these kinds of sermons bit by bit during the wars. It's a very normal rhetoric that appears everywhere. And it then trickles out of that into letters and into diaries, into journals. People who are on military campaign write about what verses are being used on Sundays for the sermons they're listening to.
Wow.
So I know that you know how exciting this is, right?
That's so cool.
Right? Yeah. So some pastors keep a track of what the sermon listing is for every sermon they give, and you can track when they're on military campaign as army chaplains. It's like the diaries that you get from pastors don't necessarily have full sermon text, but have a list of, I gave this sermon here and what date it is and what you're doing. It's like the people who serve as military chaplains. I have like 2 or 3 journals that I've like at least copied down that section of like, what verses are you using when you're a military chaplain in like the 1710s on expedition against Canada? What are you doing like the 1740s? And I mean, Catherine Allen Smith's book on what verses you're using in Crusade Chronicles. Yes. Like we're all using the same verses. The militant verses of the Bible are the militant verses of the Bible.
Yeah.
And we're still using this same language that you notice in the 12th century, again in the 18th.
We interrupt these Middle Ages to take you to space. Pale Blue Pod is a sister show on Multitude, an astronomy podcast for people who are overwhelmed by the universe but want to be its friend. Hosted by astrophysicist Dr. Moiya McTier and her best friend ConStar, together they demystify space one topic at a time. Hopefully, by the end of each episode, the cosmos will be a little less scary and a lot more freaking cool. New episodes drop every Monday. Who's ready for hot Jupiter winter? You definitely are, so check the show out. Now, back to American Medieval. So one of the questions that I had, you were talking about the verses that you see, as campaign, which is just like, as a medievalist, like, oh my God, I would die to have this kind of information, especially when we're talking about kind of the Crusades. And sometimes those things appear, right? Like, especially in sermons. Do you see within these kind of early English settler documents any sense that this is part of a tradition? Like that they are referencing not just the verses themselves, but kind of the long history of commentaries, anything like references to the fathers, anything from other early modernity or medieval or anything like that? Or is it really just kind of, this is the sermon, like I'm using my own kind of Enlightenment genius in order to present this material?
So it depends on the sermon and depends on the topic and it depends on the setting. Most of the people that I read end up being part of like broader intellectual networks. And so we can really trace the things that they're reading, the libraries that exist. I got really excited because of Raymond Daguier in looking at like what libraries writers had available, because we have a library catalog for Le Prix, and it's one of my favorite things that I've researched. We have a handful of extant libraries that are intact from the colonial period that I'm writing about.
Okay.
Which is really fun because you get a sense of like what people are reading and what people are playing around with. So like King's Chapel, the first Anglican church in Boston, their library, their original founding library, is intact and at the Boston Athenaeum. So it's not just like, do I have a library list? I have the books. I have the actual books.
You have the actual books. Wow. Okay. That's amazing. Yeah.
The Mather family library is mostly intact at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. There are bits and pieces of it elsewhere, but they have that. New York City, at the New York Society Library, they have a colonial library from New York, one of the early ones, like mid 18th century, that's intact. A guy who put together and opened like the first library. And then they also have the Winthrop family library, which is so much weirder than you'd imagine, because he had it like John Winthrop had a bunch of John Dee's books.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, stuff gets really weird incredibly quickly. So like, you have a ton of people who are going to school under a Mather and have their own books. There's a guy who I really like studying named John Bernard, who is the pastor at Marblehead. There's a separate John Bernard who's the pastor of Andover at the same time. Okay. It's very frustrating trying to figure out which one is which.
Man, I just wrote a book in which everybody's named Pepin. So like I know about confusing names. So yeah.
Fair enough. Given the time period that you're writing on. Yes. We only have 3 names in southern France, and all of them are a variation of Raymond. So like fair enough. I get it. I can now identify my correct John Bernard signature because I've looked at enough places. He has a English language translation of Pierre Giraud, who's this famous Huguenot theologian. The French text is Accomplissement de la Prophétie. It's basically a apocalyptic book about how the persecution of the Huguenots are actually the 2 witnesses in Revelation.
No kidding. Okay.
So the Mathers love this Huguenot shit because they're also deeply apocalyptic, and Huguenot refugees end up in New York City, the Hudson Valley, in Boston, in Narragansett, Rhode Island, and in Virginia, and they bring a bunch of stuff with them, and there's some really cool stuff to talk about there as well. The Mathers love them. They assign Pierre Giraud, they make sure that he's translated into English, they have copies. Yeah. So this one guy's personal copy that he gets in 1708, in 1710, he serves as army chaplain on Nova Scotian expedition. I have his list of sermons. I love this guy. Yeah. There's almost no marginalia in the book, and I was really disappointed. Then you get to the back flyleaves, and he's trying to recalculate the apocalypse.
Like the dating, like the years.
The dating. He's trying to redo the datings because Pierre Giraud has a specific dating, and it's like too many steps have passed, and John Bernard is trying to fix it. John Bernard dies quite old. His last published work is in 1770. And it's a book on apocalypticism, on when the second coming is going to arrive. This is his 1708 volume from when he's in school, where he's doing this calculation. 1770, he's still calculating this stuff out.
For readers, if you're not familiar, like dating within apocalyptic expectation is very important because people are trying to figure out. There's lots of kind of biblical and then kind of extra biblical text, which suggests like kind of here's roughly kind of how we can do this. But of course, there's always these warnings. It will only come like a thief in the night. You can't know the dates. But then there's references to 1,000 years in the book of Revelation. And then there's the dating the age of the worlds is supposed to matter and stuff like that. And medievalists talk about this stuff all the time. And then medievalists also say like, no, nobody really cared about this. And here we have 17th and 18th century Protestants in the Americas saying like, we need to really get this nailed down because it really matters. That's really fascinating too. And I think maybe defies our expectation is that because apocalypticism is often associated by outside observers as a specifically Catholic thing. But none of these guys are Catholic, right?
Is it really? Huh. Yeah. All the people I knew who were engaging in this rhetoric when I was growing up were Protestants of various flavors. And so like I bring so much of myself into the study that like this is just a Christian thing, which also in all fairness, the Bible's pretty clear that's just kind of a Christian thing too.
No, and I think that's totally fair, right? But I think that and maybe I'm kind of betraying my biases, right? Is that the rhetoric around kind of American religion often comes from elite circles on coasts.
Yes.
And then it's like, oh, that's like a kind of a Catholic superstition thing, or it's a thing that maybe happens in the heartland, but they don't really mean it, right? But they do.
Yes.
Yes. And they clearly do in the sources that you're talking about.
Yes. I grew up in small town Missouri, so I think there's also the part where like I'm just used to this being a normal thing that people genuinely believe in addition to everything else. And like the lived religion aspect of apocalypse and religious violence is like what I was already after. And it's kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
Some of them are putting in a learned tradition. The sermons where you're doing it are sometimes situational, right? You're preaching an apocalyptic sermon to a military camp where you're not going to do a huge amount of reference to texts they haven't read.
Sure.
But there's also a genre, we call it an Artillery Day sermon. For the Honorable Artillery Company of Boston, every year they elect new officers into it. And the company invites a pastor to preach on election day and they will publish their sermons. And people submit a topic and their thing and then they vote on it. Those artillery sermons are some of the most gloriously holy war sermons you're ever going to find, which means that people are choosing. This is not just a thing that the pastors are choosing. People are choosing and voting on and want this sermon to publish and disseminate. And in, I think it's 1747, during King George's War, the War of Austrian Succession of the continent, there is a sermon where there's just a line in it where the guy preaching it says, "A holy war in a Romish sense is but a bastard. We are engaged in the true holy war." And it's this thing. It's like crusades are bullshit. Us killing Catholics, on the other hand, that's God. God wills that. And it's this amazing moment where like, no, of course we're not crusading. Crusading is a weird popish thing. We're doing a holy war and it's completely different. We're fighting against actual pagans who happen to be Catholics and we're doing it in organized fashion led by the church. I don't understand. These aren't the same. They're all doing crusades. And you know what the best part is? Crusading is still alive and well in the 18th century. A thing we never think about, but like crusading is not a medieval thing. Crusading lasts until Napoleon accidentally ends it in 1798 when he takes the island of Malta and the Knights Hospitaller never pick up their military mission again. Benjamin Franklin is 10 years old the last time we have a discrete named crusade.
That's
Battle of Matapan, 1719. It is a holy league. The Portuguese are so thrilled for their crusading hero that they keep celebrating him through the 1750s as their crusading prince.
I remember very distinctly reading early in grad school a book, I guess, a short book, kind of a pamphlet, like an early 20th century book. So it was kind of a shorter kind of thing by Ernst Troeltsch, in which he basically argued he wasn't talking about crusading specifically, but he was saying basically that the Middle Ages ended with the French Revolution, like with the guillotine, effectively. And that blew my mind. And it wasn't that the professor at the time, like he thought it was an interesting idea, but like he wasn't necessarily buying it. But like it just helped me think about the experiences of people and kind of, especially as a very new graduate student, you know, how artificial these periods are and how you can see these lines of continuity. And like, I'm curious too about like this, I was asking about the citations earlier or something like that, but like, you can also see tradition outside of citation, right? Like you were saying, like these guys are doing the same thing these guys were doing 800 years earlier, and we should talk about why they're similar, right? Or we can talk about, I should say, why they're similar. That is a fair thing to talk about.
Yeah. I think sometimes grad school breaks us in ways that are not just our spirits, but also
it does that too. Sometimes.
It does that too. Yeah. It does that too. But also like our capacity for imagining a holistic world. Because like in order to survive comps, we have to narrow down our focus to a specific thing. And then we study really hard for comprehensive exams. We do a very narrow topic within a very rigid field because we have to read all of the books. And it's like, our periodization is about surviving grad school, not about reality.
Yeah.
And then about writing books where we haven't screwed up the literature in a way that's going to piss off a reviewer, not talking about a world that actually exists. Like all of our boundaries do this. Atlantic world's a great idea, but we are bounded by language. The idea of like, we're going to do American history because that's where the jobs are. How do you talk about American history without Europe and Africa and Latin America and also the Pacific? Like it's all world history. We just don't have time and languages and resources to do all of it. And it gives us this really weird idea of what we can and cannot do. A PhD is a research degree. You are trained to teach yourself to become an expert in a field. So how did I start teaching medieval America, which directly gets me other places? I would take classes when I was teaching a world history survey to the McClung Museum at the University of Tennessee, which had an exhibit on the medieval Mississippians. I thought, what the fuck is this? This is so goddamn cool.
Yeah.
Why have I never heard about this before? And then I went to a library. It was even just the library on campus, and I got books. And then I read the books because we're trained to read books and then follow citations. And I just did that. And when I started teaching colonial America, I started poking people for book recommendations and then read through entire categories of bibliography, and you just do the thing.
Yeah.
And then you discover that history doesn't repeat itself. I love all the charming things like, history doesn't repeat itself. It's just that humans tend to do similar stuff when you present them with the same stimuli. Century after century, we don't evolve that quickly. We're interesting, we're chaotic, but like we do the same kinds of stuff over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Which means if my interest is in this thing, which is, religious violence and apocalypticism, unfortunately, we keep doing a religious violence and also an apocalypticism forever. And so I wrote on the Middle Ages, I write on colonial America now, I also write on contemporary politics because it's just people doing the same stuff.
Yeah.
And it's just a really easy through line. And I think at a certain point, I realized that I was never going to have the resources to write the kinds of academic work on the Middle Ages that I would want to keep doing. That's not a bad thing, right? I love being in an archive. What I need is an archive. If I can't get to those archives, I'm going to switch topics to go to another archive. But like, I can write interesting enough pieces that make people think that maybe the world is a little bit more connected than it is. I'm really happy with that.
Yeah.
I wish it were a happier topic, Matt. I wish it were a happier, less awful topic, but
outside observers sometimes think we only study the things we love. And I do not love talking about religious violence. I do not love the subjects of my research in any way, shape, or form. I find them really interesting and I find them knowable. And I think it's worth knowing about them. And those are different things. But also, too, kind of related to what you're saying is that in some ways, the best ways that studying the past can work is that you have something, a class, a book, a museum exhibition, a visit to a library or an archive, or dare I say, even a podcast that kind of gets you interested in a topic, and then you need to find out more. You want to find out more, and having the skills to find out more about that topic, knowing where to go, knowing how to understand the sources, knowing to find those sources, that's what it does, right? Like it allows you to move in really interesting ways. Because like you were talking about moving kind of chronologically, but the reality is too, like even for a medievalist or even for anybody who studies a topic, like sometimes when you're changing a research focus or changing like a teaching thing, like even within your period, you have to learn a whole new set of skills, a whole new set of sources, a whole new set of archives, a whole new historiography every time you do this. And that's kind of what we do, right? That's how we understand the past.
Yeah. The chronological jump is a lot easier than changing a regional focus because I'm still just working in English and French, the languages I'm most comfortable with.
Yeah.
If you were to move from medieval France to medieval Italy, okay, well, welcome to the 3 years where you were mastering your Italian and then learning Old Italian. Good luck to you.
Oh, if you're doing medieval Italy, then you got to know Greek too, right?
Yep.
You got to go know Greek. You probably have to know, because you're going to be dealing with the Byzantines. You're probably going to have to know some Bulgarian, some Syriac, maybe a little bit of Armenian.
Yeah.
In addition to Latin and all those other sources as well. So
yeah,
language acquisition, it is fundamental. So
yes,
even for Americanists, I would say. So
just being able to read French more or less fluently opens up so many interesting things to be able to do, because most of these sources have been published at some point in the 19th century, but they're in French. It's all the new French sources are published in Quebec in French. And if you can read it, all of a sudden it opens up a lot of things. And the number of French manuscripts in American archives from this period is quite high, and you find them everywhere. And if you can read them, it does a lot.
And like you were saying too, I mean, if you're talking about New England or the northern part of the English colonies, they are very interested in Quebec, aren't they?
Yes.
They care us a whole lot about what's going on in French Canada.
The North American Babylon has to be known so you can destroy it.
That's right.
Oh, Louisburg gets referred to once as the North American Carthage. It is also all of the things you could want as a medievalist. Let's throw some classics in there just for fun.
Absolutely, yeah. on that, thinking of Quebec as the North American Babylon, which, it's a lovely town. I never thought of it as Babylon myself when I visited it. But anyway, apparently it was different back in the 17th and 18th century. We are unfortunately kind of running out of time. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation and learning so much from you today, Thomas. So thank you again for joining us.
No, thank you so much for having me.
If people do have the, kind of the bug in there, they have learned something from this podcast and they want to learn more about you or your work, how can they find you online?
The beautiful and tragic thing about me is I am the only Thomas Lecaque on Earth. If my name is there and you search for me, it's only me. I am on Blue Sky if you want to hear me rant about various small petty things. If you just want to read my actual writings in a meaningful way, find me on LinkedIn. I post everything there. Someday I will remember, as I'm remembering right now, that I should build a website. That day has not yet happened, and it will not be until after the semester dies.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for joining us. Please go check out his research and look him up online. Again, he's the only Thomas Lecaque out there, so if you find him, you found him. That being said, that brings us to the end of another episode of American Medieval. Thanks for joining us, thanks for listening, and see you again next week. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.